Does Homer sample ancient myths or steal them? Do the Trojan epics replace the Theban stories? And what exactly can we learn from Homer by what he doesn't mention? Enjoy this new perspective on a very ancient tale as we delve into the world of Homer as seen through the absence of Thebes. Confused yet? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. This Classical Wisdom Speaks episode is with Elton Barker and Joel Christensen, joint authors of both Homer's Thebes, epic Rivalries, and the Appropriation of Mythical Pasts, as well as Homer, A Beginner's Guide. Elton Barker is professor of Greek literature and culture at the School of Arts and Culture at Open University in Milton Keynes, United Kingdom. He is also the General Secretary at Pelagios Network and author of Entering the Agon, Dissent and Authority in Homer, Historiography, and Tragedy. Joel Christensen is professor and chair at the Department of Classical Studies at Brandeis University. In addition to his and Elton's joint books, he is the author of The Many-Minded Man, The Odyssey, Psychology, and the Therapy of Epic. We'll discuss women in archaic Greece, the possibility of a Theban epic, and whether or not Homer stole or sampled from other traditions. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now, onto a new way to look at a very ancient tale. Okay, I wanted to start off with the fact you guys have joint written a book called Homer's Thebes, Epic Rivalries, and the Appropriation of Mythical Pasts, which sounds like quite a mouthful. So I think we should start off a bit simpler, draw our audience in. And I think this is the first question that everybody asks, and it's in fact the title of your introduction. Why Thebes?
Why Thebes? Well, obviously it's meant to be a provocation because Homer doesn't do Thebes. It's all about with the Iliad. It's all about Troy. With Odysseus, it's like getting back to Ithaca. So the title is meant to be a provocation. Why are we saying Homer's Thebes? Homer doesn't. That's not what his gig is. But actually, beyond the provocation, I think if you start looking, you find a lot of Thebes. Actually, and I think that's the fascinating aspect. And just a couple of basic examples. You think of the beginning of the Iliad, and when we learn about the city from which Achilles has taken Briseis, it's just kind of a throwaway point, really. But the city is called Thebes or Thebe. We differentiate with the translation. But of course, it's not that Thebes, or it's not indeed the other Thebes, Egyptian Thebes. It's a Thebes that's on the Troad. So it's a, kind of an unknown Thebes, a made-up Thebes in a way, but there's already a sense of Thebes being there and then not there. And I think another good example that's been brought out quite nicely using digital technology, which is something else. So the other part of my life, in a way, is working with digital technology. There's something that Jenny Strauss-Clay and her team have done with Catalogue of Ships. By mapping the catalogue of ships and following the way in which Homer moves around the Greek mainland and across to the islands, and seeing kind of patterns by having mapped the contingents, something interesting emerges again with the Boeotian contingent, which is the largest in the Iliad. We have all of these places mentioned, apart from Thebes. There's Hyper Thebes, it's kind of the lower Thebes is mentioned. But if you map all the places in the Boeotian contingent, it's like spokes coming out from a wheel, and the central node would be Thebes. So there's your absent presence. Thebes not there and yet there continually.
So, and to add to where Elton is going here is that this absence is felt throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's not something we actually sensed or really knew when we started working on the project. So another reason why Thebes is it builds off of questions that arise from other poems that aren't Homer. Right. So we have a couple things going on here, both how and what Homer is and the world that Homeric poetry comes from. And that other poem is Hesiod's Works and Days, which has this famous passage where it says the race of heroes was extinguished by Zeus in two things, right? Fighting for the flocks of Oedipus around Thebes and fighting for the sake of lovely haired Helen. Right. So there's this thing about Thebes that it's prior to Troy, that it's equal to Troy in some way, that once you start looking at how much it's sort of suppressed in the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is sort of the language we come to, it gets to be pretty damn interesting. Right. I mean, it's one of those things where I think we started off by noticing a thing and then we got into some sort of a CSI Thebes situation, like following these clues. And with anything, I have to tell stories. So we didn't set out years ago to write a book about Thebes. We set out years ago for Elton to write a talk together at Columbia University. Right. So this is a little color commentary to this. I think it was 2007. He visited me in New York, and we had already written our first article together, which is about the New Archilochus fragment. And he showed up. He said, "Look, I'm giving a talk at NYU. I know what that's about. But I have to give a talk at Columbia about Oedipus in the Odyssey, and you're going to help me write it." And I was like, "Oh, happy vacation, right? Nice surprise." So at the time, it was really rainy in New York, and I was in a basement apartment, and it was flooding, which was beautiful. So it smelled great. And we just spent two days holed up, maybe 3 days, going through this passage about Oedipus in the Odyssey, which tells a really weird story. Right. And the basic story is that Odysseus says, "I saw Oedipus, and his mother in the underworld. His mother's name is Epicaste." And then he tells a story of how she hanged herself after finding out the truth about her and her son. But Oedipus went on ruling in Thebes and married someone else and had different children. And I remember Elton and I were reading it, we're just like, what's this about? And so it started this thing, which is both of us in our method, we're sort of, in some ways, very classic Homerists, and that we just look at everything in Homer referring to Thebes and anything having to do with Thebes. And we just said, look, there's something here that's not here, right? There's something missing. And
this doesn't seem like a very intuitive way to enter a problem by searching for something that's not there. I want to go back a little bit, if I may, because back to something, Joel, actually, you mentioned, like, just kind of quickly as a throwaway, but I think for a lot of people, they might not think of intuitively. You mentioned that was Thebes considered equal to Troy? And I think that might be a big jump for some people who don't know as much about Thebes. So the question, therefore, is Thebes equal to Troy? How do we know that? And if it is, why has so much of its significance been lost?
So I'll start with that one and hand it off to you, Elton. So from teaching a myth class, one of the things you note is until the Trojan War, so much of what happens in Greek myth and storytelling is actually centered around Thebes. Right, it's a ground zero for gods. You get Dionysus, you get Heracles, right? It's a foundational city for thinking about Greek immigration and autochthony with the story of Cadmus coming. And it's one of the first major coalition stories, right? And that's two stories of the Seven Against Thebes and the Epigone. So everything you could really need in a myth system happens at Thebes, right? And then Troy comes along and it's bigger and badder and it's the next stage. So there's a really naive retelling of myth where we could say, look, first there was Theban narrative, and then there was Trojan, right? And in the first and second structure of the Hesiod I mentioned earlier, you get that impression, right? But we really wanted to think of it as, if Thebes is positioned as being this sort of primal place in Greek myth, how is it that over time Troy comes to supplant it? And we went through, so part of our process that Elton can talk about more is breaking away from traditions of thinking of things in strict hierarchies. Thebes first, Troy second, or Troy second, therefore better, and all those things. And thinking more fluidity of the relationship between traditions, local and general, and poets and stories. And really think about what does it mean to have a relationship between these cities and their narrative traditions? And how is that dynamic meaning played out through the epics that we have? So as a quick note before I pass it off, there were epic traditions around Thebes. So we have fragments of the Thebes, which tells the story of Oedipus, the Oedipodeia, the Epigone. They just don't exist anymore. So part of our sort of CSI Thebes approach, is there anything about the nature of the Homeric epics that explains why people would prefer them more? right? Is it more than accidental that we don't have these other poems?
And Joel mentioned these other poems, that we don't have them anymore. We have snippets, fragments, and there are later testimonia. And it isn't just about Thebes as well. There are other what are called epic cycle poems and materials out there, but all have to be reconstructed. And that's been the tendency going to Homer, is to try to reconstruct these other epics, actually. But our way of doing it is really to look at what Homer's doing and what Homer's doing with Thebes, and not just taking over Theban ideas and concepts, but making them speak to his narrative, or his narrative, making them speak to both the Iliad and Odyssey, whether we're thinking of Homer as an individual, a real person, or more generally what the Iliad and Odyssey traditions are doing. And I think that's quite important to point out. There's also a wealth of evidence. Joel's pointed to, and I really like the expression he's used there, that Thebes is kind of ground zero.
Yeah,
and
I like that one too.
We don't have epic, we have a ton of other stuff, what we might think of as later materials, particularly from tragedy, and of course a wealth of material culture, wealth of visual evidence that really bring out the importance of Thebes, with representations of Dionysus or Heracles, or the various foundational stories. And there's that idea of foundational that I think is key here. And I just want to pick up on that passage that Joel's already mentioned in Hesiod. What we're getting there is where Hesiod is talking about the races of man. We have the kind of, everyone's familiar with that decline from the Golden Age to the Iron Age. Us poor folks have to live in this miserable time where we have to work on the land, and there are wars and our rulers are unjust, etc. And the heroic age seems to kind of disrupt to a certain extent that decline. So you have the gold and silver, bronze, then the heroic age, and then our Iron Age. So the heroes are the race before ours, the age before ours. And there's a sense that what Hesiod is doing is mapping out in the Works and Days, rather like what he does with the Theogony, is where we're coming from. And you can think of the Theogony and Works and Days as bookending. That's the wrong metaphor to use, because we shouldn't really be thinking of books, but bookending the beginning of the cosmos to the beginning of our society now in the Iron Age. And with that brief reference to Troy and Thebes as being the sites for where the heroes were destroyed, and again, there's a nice wealth of other traditions relating to the will of Zeus, and that part of what the story that the Iliad has to tell is, in fact, the destruction of the race of heroes. Why isn't it that we don't have any heroes anymore? Well, so many were killed at Troy. And we can imagine something happening similar, potentially. The fact that it took two to sack Thebes and so many heroes have died. But that sense of the foundational narrative, I think, is very important. And that, to some extent, structured our way of thinking, again, for Homer's Thebes. So we were thinking in terms of, and this is something that Barbara Graziosi and Johannes Haubold have earlier mapped out, that sense of all of the four primary early Greek epic poems map out a foundational story. I mentioned the Theogony before, the birth of the cosmos. I mentioned Works and Days before. This is where we are now. And the Iliad and Odyssey nicely slot in to that story arc. So we start off with a world full of gods in a way, certainly a world full of interfering gods. It's not only the will of Zeus that's kind of headlined there at the beginning alongside Achilles' anger, but before you know it, Apollo's involved. It's his anger that kicks off the story of Achilles' anger. Hera's continually interfering in book one, as is Athena. At the end of book one, there's the nice scene of Olympus that plays out what we've just seen among the Achaean ships with strife. But of course, we don't in the end get strife breaking out on Olympus, because all that, the strife on Olympus, has already been done and dusted. The Theogony tells that tale. The Iliad's not going to tell that tale, although we might think it refers to it there. But what the Iliad story tells is where we move from that world of gods to a world where at the end, the gods are absenting themselves, staying outside the tent, as Achilles and Priam meet face to face. So that sense of human action becoming more important, the fact that the Iliad ends with the burial of Hector, and then the Odyssey, in many ways, picking up from we picked off, we ended with the Iliad. So there's still a divine apparatus in the Odyssey, but it's much more distant. It's beginning to look a little bit like what we might say is our society, where we know the gods are there, but they don't really appear to us, at least not in their, not as themselves. They might appear as somebody else. So we have Athena intervening again, but often in the shape of another figure. And to the special people marked out in the Odyssey, Odysseus and his family. So we get this, I think, nice movement from the Theogony to the works and days with the Iliad and Odyssey positioning themselves. And then the question is, well, did the Theban epics do something similar? Were they also foundational tales? And if so, in what ways might we imagine? And possibly how the Homeric poems are doing all that you need, actually. And you don't need the Theban poems anymore. You have a sack, with the sack of Troy, or the constantly delayed sack of Troy, rather, you get in the Iliad. Why do you need another sack? We've got that tale already. We've got the Iliad. And then, of course, the journey home. So there's that element too regarding whether these poems, in the end, are the only two that you need to tell the story of where we come from.
And I think what Elton's bringing out well there is where our work itself and the journey went from worrying about the detail to really focusing on what the epics we have can tell us about their relationship with their traditions that we've lost, but also how looking at these relationships illuminates the poetics that we have. And so I think along the way, we've tried different methodologies for thinking about Homer, different models for thinking about composition, performance. And the question itself, though, how and why do the Homeric poems use Theban material in the way they do, I think has really reshaped over time what we think like Homeric poetry.
Just to add to your point about the movement of gods to mortals, and I think you point this out in the introduction, but I think it's a really clear illustration even is how Achilles is semi-divine, and then Odysseus is, like, it's the very first sentence, it's about how human he is. So I think just to say that transition I thought was really fascinating and really interesting to show that the importance of that movement. And so to get to then the Theban epics, if you don't need another Theban epic, do we certainly know that there was one? I mean, if they didn't need to replicate it. But I guess the main question of the entire book then is, how does Homer use the Theban myths? I mean, what do we learn about Homer from the lack of Thebes?
So, I mean, to put it simply, I think that we learned that Homeric poetry will do whatever it can to appropriate from other traditions and use it to position itself as the master tradition. Right? And that's, I mean, beyond a shadow of a doubt to me at this point, I see Homeric poetry as, the old Borg from Star Trek. Right, taking on the traditions and integrating it, taking what's useful and what's not, and then repositioning other traditions as it retells them in some way as anticipatory or in service of it. And a good example, I think, comes from that line from Hesiod and the way Greek poetry works. So I'll give you this one thing. So there's something we talk about a bit in the book called the Anticipatory Doublet. It's a phenomenon in Greek poetry where you'll say one thing happens, and then you'll top it off with something else. Say, okay, I went to the store and then I got in a car accident, right? And so the pattern that's built up, both narrative and grammar, anticipates what comes next, but then what comes next replaces it in importance. And basically what we've come to argue in the book is that's the way the Homeric poetry positions everything that comes before it. Right? So the moment of performance, the moment of composition privileges the story being told above and beyond everything that came before. So I'm at the point where I actually don't know if I could believe anything Homer says about Thebes, right? Because everything that exists in the Iliad and the Odyssey exists for the function of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It doesn't exist for Thebes. So that's really changed the way I view the almost violent Homeric epic vis-a-vis other traditions.
Well, no, I just want to ask, because it sounds at first like you're saying Homer is sampling Thebes, and that is usually when you're referencing a past artist to literary reference, anything, it's usually sort of done out of respect. It's sort of like a nod, like a tip. I mean, you think of 18th century classical music, like anybody who liked anything would pick and throw it in and just say like, hey, I like your work. So, but it also sounds like you're saying that this was sort of like an aggressive takeover of mythology. Like this is, like the Han Dynasty. I'm gonna take over Polynesia or something. Like, is it out of respect or dominance or just is it a nod? I mean, how
Well, I think to
much do you
nod,
take over?
I think to nod to a tradition, it has to have an existence and an authority that belongs to someone and has cultural value that would be recognized, right? So one of the things and I'm not quite, we haven't checked our temperature on this lately, Elton, so I'm not quite sure if we're closer together or farther apart. We go back and forth over time on how important we think authorship is. And I definitely want to subtract the product from the author, especially for Homer. And I worry why I'm concerned more with the effect and the outcomes. And so I think, what happens more and more, I think, and this is accidental, but also contextual, I think of narrative traditions as viruses, right? That survive by combination, recombination, and they select what's most useful to get the most interest in the audience, right? And so when a virus adapts or mutates and it looks like another virus, it's not nodding. Right? Not acknowledging, it's not giving credit, it's engaging in expedience, right? So I think part of it is that, yes, you could say, well, in our tradition, talking about the Theban tradition, maybe saying, hey, I'm calling out to Thebes, but it's also about taking Thebes and subordinating it to your narrative to show how your narrative is more important. Right. So the signal example of that, it really goes against everything you might expect if you read like, Encyclopedia Britannica overview of Homer, is this conversation in book 4 among Agamemnon, Diomedes, and Sthenelus. Do you want to tell that story, Elton?
Yeah, this was the example I was going to leap into before. I mean, this is great. So this is the context of Agamemnon berating his troops. Another interesting analysis into Agamemnon's makeup as a leader. Actually, he's hasn't done very well so far in the Iliad, and I'm not sure if this kind of negative psychology is going to work either. In any case, he berates Diomedes by drawing attention to the fact that he's the son of Tydeus, and look how great Tydeus was, and then Agamemnon gives this very odd tale that hints at Thebes, but is more about Tydeus defeating ambushers on the way back, killing them all, he's surviving. And of course, from other sources, we know that was not that likable character. He ate the brains of one of the people he kills. And actually, I think Athena might reference that in the Iliad. So there's that bit that Agamemnon glosses over. And of course, as well, not Diomedes, it's his colleague Sthenelus who responds to Agamemnon. That's already an interesting dynamic, I think, relating to the coalition aspect that we want to bring out with the Iliad. And that's perhaps something that had been there in the Theban tradition, but something that certainly the Iliad very much enforces. So Sthenelus, who replies, not Diomedes initially, and Sthenelus kind of makes the obvious point, well, Tydeus and his mates, they didn't sack Thebes, we sacked Thebes. So we have two figures in the Iliad, Sthenelus and Diomedes, who have already sacked Thebes. And it wasn't that big deal. It gets a couple of lines. Yeah. What the big deal is here in the Iliad, actually. That's the big deal. And that's what they've already been here 9 years. We've already been told that. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be, we're not even going to get the sack of Troy in this epic. The sack of Troy is too epic for the Iliad.
Right, it's too big. But just to add to this, I mean, so what happens from this? So this example is clear. So we tell the story of Thebes, we tell it sideways, right? And then we tell it in a derogatory fashion. And then we say a really radical thing to the epic tradition, which is we say that we're better than our fathers were. Everywhere else in the epic, when you hear about the relationship between generations, like Hector picks up a stone that's so big, 2 men today with a cart couldn't move it, right? So Peyton does the same thing. Everything in epic is bigger and stronger than we are, but the people in epic are better than their fathers, which goes against the grain of that decline of the civilization. So, I absolutely agree that there's this nodding to Thebes, but the nodding is more of a gesture to, look, you might think Thebes is cool, but it's all kind of shabby and small. Instead, look at this story, right? So every time Thebes is brought to bear, it's brought to bear in order to one-up it. Right? And that, I mean, that's something perhaps we didn't sense before, but, and of course, it's saying anything's every time with Homer is dangerous, but most of the time, this is what's going on with the strategy. And it's so consistent that it really made us think differently about how Homer treats all other previous traditions.
Well, I'm really feeling sorry for Thebes, I gotta say. But okay, I'm gonna ask a question, and maybe this sounds a bit sacrilegious or something to ask. I don't know. When I think of Greek mythology, I think most people think of Greek mythology. They kind of think of these like sort of stories that are very ingrained, and we have this sort of sense of the sacred for these myths, just myths in general, because they go in far in the past, and we kind of hold a sense of reverence. And when people change myths, we kind of feel defensive about that. I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the ancient world, these myths were more in the profane, I think, than the sacred, that you could twist and adapt them. And, you think of Euripides just going bonkers on so many stories. And, you think of like, Medea never killed her children according to the Corinthians, but then Euripides comes along, yeah, I'm going to make this cool. And when I try to think of like a modern comparison, and I always think of like Batman stories, because they're stories that everybody kind of knows. There are a sense of heroes, and like you can have the origin stories, and then along you come up with a movie like Joker, and it kind of twists everything on its head. And for our modern audiences, we're like, yeah, this is great. Like, we love seeing a different angle of it. And so I sometimes like to think that's how the ancients felt about their own myths, that they liked hearing different stories of it, that they were fodder for entertainment and changing values and norms in society and rethinking things, that they weren't sort of museum pieces. And so the question then, is it bad that Homer switched things up with Thebes? I mean, is that sort of the natural way that myths go?
I think you're right. I mean, let me have a go first this time, and then I'll let Joel off the leash. But I think you're absolutely right. I don't see this sacrilegious at all. I mean, myth is always about the past, but speaking to the present. Yeah, and you mentioned the Batman regeneration. Yeah, and especially under Christopher Nolan with Batman Begins, which. And I think it's a very nice example, because I think the more that you bring to that tale, the more you know your Batman, the more you're going to get out of that. And I think something similar is happening with the Homeric poems. We start off with the Iliad. I think it's totally a radical take. Sure, we know about Achilles. Yeah, we know he gets angry. We know about Troy. But what's this? It's the heroes being sent to Hades. That sounds, it's an off-key note already. And it's his own men, Achaeans, being sent. What's going on here? And then that opening section where we don't get main heroes fighting as we might imagine. It's an old man coming to get his daughter back. Then again, a little bit of a sideways shift into this big story about Troy, but of course it's going to be hitting all the key notes. It's something that Achilles, when he's got time to reflect in book 9, will look back and start making the connections between Agamemnon taking his woman and the fact that the Trojans took Helen. What's different here? Why are we fighting if not because of this? And look what you've done, Agamemnon. So this is I think, and the interesting, point here for thinking of Homer's relationship to Thebes is how Homer's making what we might think as this international epic, Greeks versus, or Achaeans versus Trojans. It's still going to be about conflict. We are going to get, of course, Trojans and Achaeans fighting. It'd be silly to claim otherwise. We aren't going to get the fall of Troy, however. That's, even this long epic's not going to be that long to be able to tell that tale. But what the focus of the Iliad is, I think, rather than Troy, rather than fighting against the Trojans, it's internal conflict. Right from the beginning, Homer turns conflict onto the Achaeans themselves. So the big catalyst for the Iliad and from book 1 is the fight between Agamemnon and Achilles. This is internal conflict. This is about politics rather than warfare. And that, for me, for us, is the interesting thing, what we think Homer's doing with Thebes. If there's one thing we know about Thebes, it's internal conflict. Look at all those tragedies, look, thinking about civil strife, the other city. And what the Iliad does is, again, capture this main, what we might think of as one of the main Theban themes, and make that the core aspect of the Iliad in selling this new Troy story. That's really, I think, the fascinating aspect. This is going to be as much about politics as about warfare. And that also keys into that idea about foundational narratives. We are laying down foundations for a new kind of politics, which is about standing up to authority. It's about having your say in the assembly. And that's something that we, Greeks, anywhere across the Greek world, whether we're in an oligarchy or in an emerging democracy, we understand that kind of politics. We understand that kind of behavior. The Iliad laying down institutions after the heroes themselves have departed from this earth.
I mean, Elton put it all better than I would there, and I just want to add two things to the framing, right? So for us, the approach to Homer that we want to model is a corrective against the approach that treats Homer as canon. Right? Now, Homer may have become canonized for later generations, but in the moment of performance, I think that play, surprise, and innovation were central to the performance context. Right? So I think we all read Homer in a way that may be appropriate if you're reading Homeric influences on Virgil, maybe, but not appropriate for the way Homer developed in its original context. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, and we tend to assume and project a monoculture on ancient Greece, when Greece was a pluralistic culture that was multicultural, right? And part of why the Iliad is, I think, accidentally so full of meaning ambiguous is in its marketplace of ideas, it had to appeal to wide audiences of diverse experiences, interests, and visions of the world. So that's why you get this a really squishy text. You can never pin it down. It's always working with double, even triple motivation and ideology. And I think that part of our problem, and this is where we can get political in our own time with it, is that we enforce a type of reading in our schools and in our scholarly circles that's monological, that assumes we have a monoculture that and goes top down in authority. And I think that to read Homer, to enjoy Homer in a way that's truer to the spirit of the narrative, is to reintroduce the chaos and to reappreciate how multicultural the epic had to be in its development.
I like that point. Personally, I'm a huge Sappho fan, and I always like to remind people that she was considered equal to Homer, back in those days, and that people loved her and her work extensively. And
we are radical enough, and I actually don't think it's that radical though, to see Homer as responding to Sappho rather than Sappho responding to Homer. Right? I think their performance and textualization processes happen over such a period of time that we have to see them as entangled rather than in response.
And that was Joel mentioned our work on Archilochus, our paper on the new Archilochus, which is where things kicked off in a way. And that was our angle, actually, not to think of Archilochus as responding to Homer, again, thinking of that top-down hierarchy, but thinking of these two traditions very much playing off each other. Because if you flip it, look at all those scenes of banqueting and symposium in the Odyssey. Scenes, of course, which don't go well. One of the first instances might be, think of when Odysseus is starting to tell his tale to the Phaeacians, again, another scene of banqueting and symposium, incidentally. You have Odysseus sacking a city in one half a line, actually. So, we've done Troy, we can do that in half a line. And then his companions, I think it's okay to picnic by the beach, have a bit of a barbecue, while the neighbors of the city that they've sacked then get together and attack. And of course, Odysseus and his men escape barely and lose, so many ships. And that's just one scene. But of course, the archetype of bad symposiasts in the Odyssey are the suitors. And that's very much in play, I think, regarding they realize far too late that they're not in some kind of Archilochian, fun boy, let's all have sex and party along. They realize far too late that they're not in that kind of genre. They're in epic, and to the point where Antinous, doesn't recognize the hero in front of him. He's still drinking wine as he gets an arrow through the neck. So this is, I think, a really, you couldn't be a stronger appropriation of the simple genre, actually, that kind of statement, having an arrow through your neck while you're drinking wine. So it really gets to Joel's point about, we think it's much more productive to think of this early Greek poetry as coming from different traditions and playing off each other in their formation. And so the texts we have now are better thought of as emerging from these traditions that are playing off each other.
So I think maybe this is an opportunity to right some wrongs with regards to acknowledging some of these other traditions and epic rivals. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about some of the traditions, Thebes and otherwise, that maybe your average person doesn't appreciate in Homer's tales?
So, I mean, I think one we could talk about, just to sort of get back to the Oedipus question and the form question Elton was talking about. In scholarly circles, it's common to talk about the Catalogue of Women in genealogical poetry in Greece. What I've been thinking a lot about lately, what are the song traditions that weren't preserved, that were lost? And they tend to be those of people who are marginalized or not authorized by epic tradition. So largely women who are not epic women, and enslaved people, and people who are somehow outside the aristocratic class. So we know that there are entire traditions of genealogical poetry because we have fragments of them, and they actually prize and center women's experiences. Now, of course, they're idealized and they involve marriage and birth, etc. But they tell stories in a very different way, and they prize relationships in space and time that Elton can expand on in ways that epic poetry doesn't. Right. And I think that these lost traditions must have had marvelous stuff. So one of the things I think about, just as an example, is that Greek medical writing is missing a whole bunch of stuff about women's health, labor, and birth, except for like really strange things. Right. So I think that there were entire traditions of oral and written women's health poetry and prose that just weren't preserved because it wasn't important to men who are doing the writing and the preservation. Right. Women's work songs weren't included in traditions. So I think you can hear echoes of that and really think about the relationship between cultural authority and the preservation of narrative and form, especially when you look at Oedipus telling the story of these genealogical traditions. Odysseus. He's straight up ripping them out of other traditions, putting them in the service of his homecoming, and then selecting how he tells the tales. So again, this is just all speculation, but these traditions came from somewhere, and they had work outside the epic. And what we have is sort of the evidence of how they were used by this different tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I've done a few webinars on like Hippocrates kind of hurting women by changing the field of midwifery and making it into the field of doctors rather than continuing with, the herbs and the traditions that the women had before them. So I definitely think that's an interesting point. And I guess with genealogy as well, just about every culture has a genealogy background. Like you think of just about every holy text, there's like always a really long, boring pit about who begat who. So I don't know if that's just a purely female thing or it's kind of universal genealogy.
Well, here's the difference though. Like so Genesis traditions, they tend to be patrilineal, right? It's pretty clear that the genealogical catalogs that we have evidence of are centering women, right, in Greece. And so that's a very different type of Greece than we see in epic poetry.
Yeah, I always felt that the archaic period was a bit more female friendly, obviously, than the classical period. And I always thought, though, about, the Odyssey, because Penelope is surely the only truly good character in the book. I mean, Odysseus isn't even portrayed particularly nicely half the time.
Not a good person.
No. And then if you think about how Odysseus is portrayed by like Sophocles and Philoctetes, for instance, then he's an outright meanie. So I don't know, I guess and even when you were talking about Odysseus talking with the Phaeacians, like he's told first to go to the queen and throw himself to her knees before anybody else. I mean, you do get this sense that women are held up a little bit higher in that time period than subsequent time periods.
Well, and I would add, and I don't know if Elton wants to expand on this, I think the Odyssey does a great piece of work in undermining women's authority and in recentering male authority by the end of the poem. And so I think that what's beautiful about epic at times is it gives a peek under the curtain, as Elton likes to put it, into what was there before and what was possible. But what's incredibly frustrating is the way it lets that curtain come back down and try to recenters different things.
Well, I think with the Odyssey particularly, I still like to think of the Iliad as very much more open-ended, and as much as the Odyssey gives many different, of course, ways of interpreting it, you do get a sense that this is a narrative that's very much under the control and at the service of Odysseus. We've already talked about those poor suitors who think they're in, some other kind of genre, sympathetic, or potentially in a catalogue of women, for example. You have Hesiod's fragmentary catalogue of women where it's okay to be a suitor. You're there for the hand of Helen, and the suitors configure themselves precisely in those terms. In Book 2, they talk of themselves as the sons of the Achaeans. This is what we might think of as Iliadic language, where the woman is still up for grabs. Not, unfortunately, this one, because she already has a man. The man has already been, of course, you've mentioned the man aspect of this is much more human narrative, but of course, man also means husband. And so this woman already has a husband, and things aren't going to end very well. I just want to pick up, just very briefly, though, the Theban resonances in the Odyssey, how things end up on Ithaca. The book 24, the end of the Odyssey, that people tend not pay too much attention to. Some very interesting things going on. The return of the son who almost kills the father when Odysseus tricks his father and Laertes has a kind of a heart attack. So that element of fathers and sons, and there's already been something going on with Telemachus and Odysseus before, and there are other traditions where Telemachus comes back and kills Odysseus, incognito, so not realizing he's killed his father, which sounds very Theban. But the fact that the Odyssey ends basically with civil war, or it could be civil war, were it not for the fact that Zeus and Athena come down in really a Deus Ex Machina. This is really Euripidean tragedy at the end of the Odyssey, where you go, no, that's the narrative has to end somewhere. We're ending it here. But just as civil war is about to break out, which again is beginning to look very Theban. So there's Thebes there is always the threat where things might go. And there shouldn't really be any surprise, because a Theban figure is central, or it occupies a central part of the Odyssey. That's Tiresias, who's marked out as the Theban prophet, who's the one who tells Odysseus how to get home and what's going to be awaiting him. So you have Thebes right at the center of again, you might think Thebes has nothing to do with the Odyssey, and yet you start kind of picking away at the fringes, as we were doing with Oedipus before, and you start to see, maybe it's because we've been working on it too long, I don't know, but you start to see Thieves everywhere.
Well, I'm glad Thebes is getting a bit more acknowledgement. It's really fascinating. I would have never even thought about it. I assume most people give you that response. And so it is really interesting to get a completely new perspective on quite literally a very ancient text. Now, I just want to kind of go to a different direction just for a moment to finish up. Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with Elton Barker and Joel Christensen on classicalwisdom.com. You can find Elton and Joel's book, Homer's Thebes, Epic Rivalries and the Appropriation of Mythical Pasts on www.hup.harvard.edu.